Britain wants the world to get tough with this man. But what did Britain do when Robert Mugabe slaughtered thousands of his people in the 1980s?
People being buried alive on their graves. A woman raped in the same house, in the same room as her daughters.
There is a limit to what this country can do to impose its will, and to some extent a greater limit in the next colony with an extremely sensitive government.
This man led the killing for Mugabe, so why was he welcomed to Britain just after the atrocities and 2 years ago given vital military hardware by our government? As Robert Mugabe fights to cling to power, Panorama reports tonight from here in Zimbabwe and from Britain on an extraordinary story. It involves the massacre and torture of thousands of innocent people. It's a story that leaves Mugabe with blood on his hands and Britain in the dock, accused of appeasing a ruthless tyrant. Matabeleland, southwestern Zimbabwe. 19 years ago, this rural province witnessed some of the worst atrocities of our age. The man responsible is still in power. Robert Mugabe has unleashed a new wave of repression, but we first saw the real Mugabe in Matabeleland. Defying Robert Mugabe's ban, Panorama has travelled to the scene of his worst crimes. This is a country in a state of fear. Everywhere you go, there are militia, police roadblocks, and of course the spies whom you can't see. Now, in circumstances like this, easily the most difficult I've ever worked in, it's very, very difficult to find people who are willing to speak out about what happened 20 years ago. But there are some brave people, and I'm on my way to see them.
Shadrach Sibanda, Angeline Sibanda.
A Catholic priest who keeps lists of the missing.
Molina Mlilo, Sboniso Mlilo.
Father Hebron Wilson remembers what happened when Robert Mugabe sent his special troops, the 5th Brigade, to Matabeleland.
Umampofu, Sboniso Mlilo. The people said, Father, our children have been taken. We don't know where they are, or will we ever see them again?
Typically, what they would do, they would kill people, or not even kill them, force them to dig their own graves. Force their children, their wives, to bury them alive, and then force them to dance on top of the grave, President Robert Mugabe, you know.
Robert Mugabe had at first seemed a model African leader, democratically elected and not corrupt. But with political enemies, he was to prove ruthless. Panorama has spoken to survivors of his atrocities and to key political figures in Zimbabwe and Britain.
What he believes in above all is power, and holding on to power by all means, and therefore in effective control over the intelligence agencies, the security forces, and so forth. He also believes, as he used to tell me, that power comes from the barrel of a gun.
Mugabe's ZANU party drew its support from the Shona tribe, who made up 80% of the population and backed his call for a one-party state.
We tell our Prime Minister to tell the whole world that we need a one-party state. That's all.
That would prove devastating for the minority Ndebele tribe, who supported the main opposition.
From one particular senior intelligence officer, I had a conversation with him, and he said, you must understand our history. Until 1890, when Cecil Rhodes blew a whistle and stopped play, the Matabele raided us and treated us Shona like cattle. Now, 70 years later, the whites have gone away again, and they still believe that they are the same Matabele and we are the same Shona. In fact, they have the rights and responsibilities of a 20% ethnic minority within a majority Shona modern state, and we have to teach them their position in life. And the way to do that is to beat them until they realize we are not the same Shona they used to tyrannize in the past. Now, I found that disgusting, of course, but at least it was comprehensible. it had a certain rationality, other than mere brutishness.
The opposition leader, Joshua Nkomo, was accused of plotting a coup. Some of his supporters began a terrorist campaign against government officials and white farmers in Matabeleland. Apartheid South Africa armed and trained dissidents to destabilize Zimbabwe. But Mugabe would use the dissident attacks and the murder of white farmers as an excuse to crush all opposition.
My government will never rest until those within that party who are responsible for organizing the dissidents are crushed and crushed fully.
Mugabe was about to unleash these men, the 5th Brigade. Specially picked from Mugabe's Shona tribe, they were trained by North Koreans. The 5th Brigade would be used to crush the Ndebele, and they reported directly to Mugabe.
He knew what was going on because every day there's a security briefing. The army chief will tell him what the army has been doing over the period of 24 hours, just 24 hours. So he's briefed every day, whether there's a war going on or no war going on.
Within days of their deployment here in Matabeleland, the 5th Brigade began to spread terror among the civilian population. The people would come to know the campaign as the Gukurahundi. In English that means the wind that sweeps away the dust. For that is what the people of Matabeleland became to Mugabe's soldiers, mere dust that could be swept away. In the spring of 1983, Robert Mugabe warned villagers against supporting dissidents. Don't cry if your relatives get lost, he said.
People just being gunned down, shot, people being headed into a hut, 40 souls together, and set a light, and outside the soldiers guarding anyone who comes out or shoot. Most atrocious things, most unspeakable things were done.
All of them were wearing red berets and very unusual faces, never smiling, very unfriendly. To say I was afraid of them, I don't think it really describes exactly how I felt when I saw them. It was more than that. You know, you could feel your bones shaking whenever you heard that they were around.
Travelling through Matabeleland, you find a landscape crowded with memories of the Gukurahundi. The stories rank with the worst atrocities of our age. A family of 24 attacked in the village of Salonkwe.
One day I was sitting at home with my sister, and then they arrived. They wanted information from my father, who was the man in charge of the village. My father couldn't help them. They called him a liar and started to force us all into a hut. We were all forced inside. They planned to set the hut alight. Then one of the soldiers opened the door to let me out. I left, and then had to watch as they set the hut on fire. They burnt all the men and women inside, my mother and father included.
Within a fortnight of the 5th Brigade's deployment, the British press was reporting stories of widespread human rights abuses. The newspapers spoke of murder, rape and torture. In March 1983, Panorama broadcast a film which spoke of thousands dead and widespread abuse.
Anyone suspected of any contact with the dissidents was liable at least to a beating.
But when Panorama questioned a British officer training troops of the regular army, he seemed unaware of the tribal rivalries.
And I must answer that here in this particular unit, there's no evidence of this at all. And from what we've seen of all our students, Edward, that come from everywhere, I think that what the problems of 2 years ago have now diminished into almost nothing.
Well, in spite of all the stories out of Matabele land?
Well, there are stories in Matabele land. There are stories in Ireland. And you want to believe who writes what story.
British trainers with the regular Zimbabwean forces were not allowed near the 5th Brigade.
Because some of them, of course, had not done this particular weapon.
But they were hearing about human rights abuses, as were diplomats in Harare.
We knew that there was an insurrection or something happening in Matabele land. The 5th Brigade, which had been trained by the North Koreans, was down there, and of course reports were coming out of some fairly brutal operations. There was obviously an unhappy situation down there, to say the least.
As the former colonial power, Britain faced a dilemma. It had negotiated the end of white rule in Zimbabwe, but knew it was regarded with deep suspicion by Robert Mugabe. It didn't want to be seen to interfere in its former colony, but it became Zimbabwe's biggest aid donor.
We shall give you all possible support in developing a spirit of reconciliation throughout Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, and ensuring the next decade there will be one of peace and prosperity.
But in the spring of 1983, Robert Mugabe's 5th Brigade was destroying the dream of peace in Matabele land. Pregnant women were attacked at a clinic.
You know what happens with the pregnant women? They go for checks monthly and to see what happens. So they were caught at this other clinic in this area. They were made to sing, they were grouped and made to sing. And that was the last time they opened their mouth, because they had to cut like that. And the foot was out. So by the time we came to that clinic, they were already dead and they were close, to put some blankets on to cover them up.
Can I just ask you, we have to be very specific about
Right.
this. What was the name of the clinic?
That call it Ntaleni Clinic in the Jombe area.
And what exactly did you yourself see?
I saw the dead people there, dead ones.
Two names recur in this horror. Robert Mugabe, who sent in the 5th Brigade, and his close associate, the brigade commander Perence Shiri. To officers from the regular army, Perence Shiri was a distant figure.
He's not talkative. He tends to be by himself, drinking all the time. Appears lonely to me. And I won't describe him as an intellectual type now. It's just an ordinary chap. Below average, if you like.
Shiri did more than give orders.
I saw him demonstrating what he meant by beating a person, and using a very massive log. He beat somebody thoroughly, all over the body, buttocks, head, anywhere where he could land the log.
Some eyewitnesses still live in fear of Shiri. What do the local people call this man?
They used to call him a Black Jesus.
Why?
Because he could determining life like Jesus Christ, you know. He could heal, raise the dead, whatever. So he claimed to be like that because he could say, you live or not.
In the first 2 months of the terror, Britain's then High Commissioner privately registered concern with Mugabe on 2 occasions. And then in late April, the Foreign Secretary Francis Pym said he'd made Britain's concern very clear to Zimbabwe. But mindful of attacks by dissidents, he added,
I think it's a difficult situation for Mr. Mugabe to handle. He's got to deal with the situation as he finds it. In the course of doing that, some incidents have taken place which obviously everyone disapproves of. I dare say he does himself, but he's got to get control of his country.
The Foreign Office was about to send a new High Commissioner to Zimbabwe. He faced a dilemma. Would he protest strongly about the atrocities and risk a row with the volatile Mugabe?
I think to have protested to Mugabe or to have gone on record as not liking what was going on down there would not have been helpful. Mugabe would have resented it very acutely. I think it might even been counterproductive. It might have damaged the policies we are trying to follow of helping Zimbabwe to build itself up as a nation.
Did you protest personally to Mugabe about what was happening?
No, I didn't, no.
No protest?
No, no.
Do you have any regrets about that?
No, I think this business has perhaps been rather blown up. It wasn't pleasant and people were being killed, but as I said, I don't think anything was to be gained by protesting to Mugabe about it.
What was the advice from London about how one dealt with Mugabe, particularly around something like Matabeleland?
I think the advice was that to steer clear of it in the interests of doing our best positively to help Zimbabwe build itself up as a nation.
There would be periods when no massacres took place, but the 5th Brigade remained at large. Violence may have fluctuated, but the terror was constant. In the House of Commons, neither the government or the Labour front bench condemned Mugabe. The only strong words came from a few Tories to whom the Foreign Office was guilty of appeasement. One of them asked if British aid would be withdrawn.
Sir Geoffrey Howe replied, "Our impression is that the situation in Matabeleland has improved considerably in recent months. We have nevertheless heard of these reports and are seeking to establish the facts."
What do you think of that reply now?
I think it was a typical Foreign Office reply. It avoided the issue, avoided really what was going on.
You said at the time that it was your impression things had improved considerably in recent months. What gave you that impression?
Well, the reports that we'd had at that time. We had been making representations, as I've said, since before I arrived in the Foreign Office earlier in that year. And the reports we were getting indicated changes in the pattern of behavior. And I was simply reporting what I'd had reported to me.
Because things hadn't, of course, changed.
I'm not sure about that. The evidence fluctuated from time to time according to where your evidence was coming from.
The facts were there. Hundreds, thousands of innocent Matabele had been slaughtered. And if they were seeking to establish the facts, well, all I can say is I wonder where they had been. They must have been living in another world.
But the following month, Britain suddenly got tough about a group of white detainees. Several white Zimbabwean Air Force officers had been illegally imprisoned. The Zimbabwean High Commissioner was summoned to the Foreign Office and a bitter dispute with Mugabe erupted. There were hints British aid might be cut. Mugabe spoke of sending Zimbabwe's whites to Britain. The men were eventually freed, but Mugabe professed surprise at Britain's concern.
Why is there so much concern about these men? They are not the only ones in detention. There are others as well. Is it because they are white? Is it because they are Mrs. Thatcher's kith and kin?
They were British citizens as well as Zimbabwean citizens. They were being held quite unlawfully and very badly treated. And that was raised. And obviously we'd have been in grave trouble had we not raised that. So I resent very much the suggestion there was discrimination on those grounds.
In the Ndebele tradition, the dead can only rest when the living have shed their tears. The 5th Brigade would not allow this. Many who cried were themselves murdered. It would not be possible for us to tell this story without the bravery of a small group of church people. Father Hebron Wilson collected eyewitness testimony. Others risked their lives to get it to him, like the man caught near his church.
Automatically he fell down. And then I could see, because I'd seen them before close range, with a bayonet, you see. They bayonet you near the hip, so you could screech. And that is what I actually saw. And I managed to get the national identity of that person.
You got his name?
Yeah, I got his name.
And what happened to him?
Well, he died.
In November, Foreign Office Minister Malcolm Rifkind visited Zimbabwe and met Robert Mugabe. His statement to the House of Commons on his return does not mention Matabeleland. One of the key British figures in Zimbabwe was the commander of the military advisory team, General Sir Edward Jones, who reported directly to Robert Mugabe.
Were you worried by the reports now that were coming back in of murder, torture and rape?
Yes, of course we were concerned about it. But if you go on to ask the next question, which is what could we have done about it, the answer is very little. I've already said that we were kept at arm's length from 5th Brigade, and had I raised the question critically with the army commander or with the Prime Minister, there's no doubt in my mind that the confidence that they had in us would have been undermined, and it would have been counterproductive to the work that BMAT was doing.
Delhi, November 1983. As the year was coming to a close, Geoffrey Howe and Margaret Thatcher were to meet Robert Mugabe at Chogam, the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit in the Indian capital.
You say, to the best of your recollection, Matabeleland wasn't raised. Wasn't he entitled from encounters like that? And from the failure of people at a senior level, cabinet level like yourself or Mrs. Thatcher, to condemn him on Matabeleland, that he could get away with murder?
No, he was in no doubt about our disapproval of that. Frankly, we were looking at a whole range of other issues at Chogam at that time on the Commonwealth agenda.
But how much more important could they have been?
The future was
slaughter of thousands of people, concentration camps in which there was mass rape. How much more? What issues could be more important?
The whole future of South Africa was at stake in our discussions at Chogam. The state of the East-West civil military conflict, the Cold War, was at stake.
They could have done much more. They could have insisted that Mugabe stop the action there, or the British government assistance, which has amounted to, I think, 57 million British pounds over the years, would stop.
Our influence was necessarily limited, and had we sought to, for example, withdraw or cancel our aid program, then that could well have had a negative reaction, not just on Mugabe's performance, but on the economic stability of the country as a whole.
Among the short-term self-interest points you might have put in your analysis of what our interests were, was that no British government wanted a couple of 100,000 British citizens appearing with cardboard suitcases at Heathrow, the sudden expulsion of whites. If we'd pulled the rug on the aid and, as it were, denounced Mugabe, this was a real threat.
So, for the first 8 months of the Matabeleland crisis, Britain stuck to the policy of quiet diplomacy. But there would be a new terror to challenge Britain's policymakers. In early 1984, the 5th Brigade was sent to the south of Matabeleland. A British diplomat who'd gone to the area to show solidarity with white farmers under threat from dissidents encountered the brigade.
A platoon of the 5th Brigade turned up. They had ordered all the workers from the farm to gather together. They were forcing them to sing songs in Shona, liberation songs, nothing to do with Matabeleland. They were poking them as they capered about singing these songs with their AK bayonets, not drawing blood particularly, just poking, humiliating, and then making them lie flat if they didn't sing well enough on the ground, face down, and beating them with strips of rubber that they carried with them, or with sticks.
And you saw this happening?
Saw this happening. We complained, we asked them to stop, we asked them to treat the people well because they'd done no harm, and they laughed and made quite clear they were not going to do that because that was what they were ordered to do. Whereupon, having no other choice, we left, went on our trip, leaving the workers to their fate, which was not going to be killed, it was going to be humiliated and punished physically.
How did you feel leaving?
Terrible, obviously. I mean, what would you feel yourself? But what else could we do? We weren't doing any good there. And this was happening, as we knew, across the whole of Matabeleland, very blatantly.
As part of the new strategy, Mugabe imposed a food embargo. No food aid was to be allowed into the drought-stricken region. He was trying to starve the Ndebele into submission. Soldiers told villagers they'd be forced to eat their children. Then the disappearances began. Thousands of detainees would endure the horror of Balakwe camp. Women were gang raped here, mutilated with sharp sticks. An eyewitness told us that the 5th Brigade commander, Perrin Shiri, had used rape as a weapon of war earlier in the campaign.
They took, we had about 9 lady teachers. They took them to a place called Slovela, where they were gang raped.
How do you know this?
They told us. The ladies told us, yes, after the incident. Among those 9, there was one of my girlfriends. So this is the very person who told me everything. After actually I had comforted her and told her, no, it's not your fault. Say out, please, what happened. Then she told me what happened. And parents himself actually had to line them up like that, choose the most beautiful one.
In March of 1984, Zimbabwe received a royal visitor. Prince Charles would meet the man he'd first met at the independence celebrations 4 years previously. Then, after returning to Britain, the Prince would have lunch with a newspaper editor who had published his own eyewitness account of the atrocities. Donald Trelford's story in The Observer had provoked a major controversy in Britain.
I was invited to lunch by Prince Charles. It was part of a charm offensive, I think, by Prince Charles and Princess Diana, and I went to lunch with Peter Preston, the editor of The Guardian, just the two of us. And in general conversation over lunch, because it was soon after I'd been to Matabeleland, and obviously it was a subject to talk about, the subject came and said, oh yes, there's massacres in Matabeleland. The Foreign Office told me it was all exaggerated. Well, I was tempted. Had it been any other dinner party, I would have taken up the cudgels. But I sort of said, I'll let it pass. It's too complicated. But I was shocked that the whole thing could be swept away quite so easily.
In April, Malcolm Rifkind expressed his government's concern to a Zimbabwean cabinet minister. The Deputy High Commissioner privately warned Zimbabwean ministers a shipment of EU food aid might be delayed. The Foreign Office may not have known the detail of the horror, but what it did know was troubling enough.
Clearly we knew that atrocities were being committed. I did not know, although we had very good information, anything like the scale of killing that has since been revealed. By the time I left, it had stopped, and I would have put the killing in the low thousands.
The low thousands. In May 1984, a minister said Britain condemned human rights abuses wherever they occurred in the world, but had no right to interfere in Zimbabwe's affairs and no responsibility for them.
We had very much an eye to what was happening in South Africa at the time with apartheid, and we were hopeful that Zimbabwe would be something of a contrast, and South Africans would look at Zimbabwe and say, oh, yes, it is possible to work as a multiracial society. So I think Matabeleland is a side issue, and the real issues were much bigger and more positive and more important.
They were supposed to speak up. That was gross irresponsibility on the part of that British ambassador to say that's maternal a side issue. He should imagine if his own family is being murdered, is that a side issue?
After nearly 2 years of terror, with the Ndebele crushed, the 5th Brigade was withdrawn. But the mastermind of their atrocities, Terence Shiri, was about to go on to much greater things, and Britain would help him on his way.
Terence Shiri, above all, knew precisely what was happening. He gave the orders. And he, if nobody else, he deserves the World Court. The crimes committed by the 5th Brigade under his command were gross crimes against humanity.
But this is not a world court. It's a state-financed institute of learning, one of the most prestigious of its kind in the world, and it's here in London. A place that promises access to statesmen and government officials.
The British government knew that the 5th Brigade had committed serious abuses of human rights in Matabeleland. It also knew that the 5th Brigade was commanded by Terence Shiri. So what did it do? Did it push for an investigation of Terence Shiri, press for him to be brought before a court? No. In fact, the British government allowed Terence Shiri to come here to the Royal College of Defence Studies in London as an honoured guest.
I think I'm right in saying that he was the first officer from the ZNA to go to the Royal College of Defence Studies. And we had him down here for lunch one day because I felt it was, I wanted to hear the news from home, so to speak. And he came down here. We had a most enjoyable Sunday lunch, and he charmed our other guests.
Do you know what the Ndebele called him?
No.
Black Jesus.
I'm sure.
Because he was the bringer of divine retribution.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They remember him as a war criminal.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you feel any unease about the kind of welcome he was given in this country, not just by yourself, but by the fact that he was brought to the Defence Studies College.
Well, I think that all of these things, it's very easy to question these sorts of things, but undoubtedly he was the man who was going to be important in Zimbabwe, and I think it was important that we should influence him positively insofar as we could.
That's unforgivable. Unforgivable. He should not have been allowed into Britain. He should never have been allowed into Britain. I've no doubt that if you sat opposite Milosevic, he'd be a very charming man. He would no doubt offer you a glass of wine and have a chat about the weather. There was so much had been said about Hitler in the early days. Terence Shiri is undoubtedly a charming man, but Terence Shiri was responsible for the deaths of many thousands of people in Matabeleland. Horrifying deaths, not easy deaths, horrifying deaths. Perhaps Jack the Ripper was a charming man.
Terence Shiri rose to the top of Zimbabwe's power structure, becoming head of the Air Force. Just 2 years ago, Britain came to his aid by selling him crucial parts for these Hawk 200 jets. Tony Blair himself approved that decision. Now the men London failed to confront in the past have come back to haunt Britain. When Robert Mugabe started to seize white farms 2 years ago, it was his old friend Terence Shiri, the commander of the 5th Brigade, who was called in to organize the terror.
Mugabe, because he was unrestrained, because he was allowed to do anything he wanted, he even dared then to turn on the whites, which he would never have done initially, unless he felt, well, people are not taking any notice, they're not bothering, I can go on to the next phase and start taking their land unconstitutionally, beating them up, sending in people to beat them up, having the opposition killed. He just knew, because of the silence, he could get away with murder.
It is true that the international response to the crisis in Matabeleland was extremely feeble, indeed almost non-existent. I think that there should have been stronger protests, yes, at the time, not just by us, but by others, about what was happening there, because it was a horrible precedent. But I want to come back to what's happening now. I'm less interested in the mistakes we made 18 years ago than in the mistakes that could be made now. And unless we're prepared to be much tougher about this kind of thing, when this sort of thing happens in Bosnia or Kosovo, the world gets its act together and acts, and Milosevic ends up facing a crimes tribunal in The Hague. Now, if we really want to do something about these situations in Africa, we can't, sort of fail to try to do something similar if we really want to make a difference in Africa.
Such fighting talk has come 19 years too late for the Archbishop of Bulawayo, a man relentlessly condemned by Robert Mugabe. He defies death threats to speak out for human rights and wonders why others failed to do so in the past.
People must try and feel with those who are involved, how they feel. It's quite nice to say from the ivory tower, no, it will make no difference. Yeah. But try and feel with those people who are feeling the pinch. It makes then a difference. At least you can say, I tried, even if you failed. I tried my best.
Of course he has total sympathy with the situation that now prevails there. And one has a total understanding of how he might have wished for things to happen differently in the past. But that is applying the wisdom of hindsight. We did not have power to control what Mugabe did.
The victims of Mugabe's terror. Most do not even know where the bodies of their loved ones have been dumped.
Bangakwenza bangawubona umthetho ongabakhathaza bona bangawubona ngaphi kanti bafana bazawubona ngaphi bona bebo bakhosi ababulala abantu kangaka abasoze babone basoze babone lokho kwabona thina esaphelelwa ngabantu bona basoze baphinde bakubona angikholwa sini
vele ngihlala ngicabanga ngakho vele isikhathi sonke isikhathi esiningi vele sihlala singadlanga vele so akula nto engangizuthi ngiyekele ucabanga ngidlala ngokucabanga every time kasi ucabanga ngakho senhle ngikubona into eyenzakala ekhaya ukufika kimi kubona umjilo wonke lo kwesikhathi esifike ngiyabona ukuthi khona kuzayenza ukuthi ngibe poor for all of my life.
Britain knew the real Mugabe from the very earliest days of his rule. It did face a dilemma in Zimbabwe, but by putting its faith in quiet diplomacy, it ended up becoming a bystander to crimes against humanity.
You can comment on tonight's programme now and join me for a live discussion on our website at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Next week on Panorama, should Britain join the Euro? Let the two sides know what you think. You can vote on our website. The address, as always, www.bbc.co.uk/panorama.